The sun was dipping below the horizon along the Texas highway as Staff Sergeant David Thompson guided his dusty black Chevrolet Silverado into Parker's filling station. The modest gas stop stood solitary on the outskirts of Fort Hood, its neon lights flickering faintly in the encroaching dusk. The structure was a relic of another era, with faded signage and a single gas pump that had seen better days. After a year stationed overseas, even the simple sight of a regular American gas station felt surreal to David. The familiar smells of gasoline and asphalt were a welcome change from the harsh scents of his deployment. He pulled up to pump number 5, the gravel crunching softly under his tires. His military fatigues were still sharp and pristine. He hadn't taken the time to change after landing. The uniform bore patches and insignia that told stories of his service: the airborne wings, the Ranger tab, the Special Forces insignia. All he could focus on was getting home to surprise his wife, Emily, and their 7-year-old son, Lucas. They weren't expecting him for another week, but he'd managed to catch an early transport stateside. The thought of seeing their faces filled him with a warmth that eased the fatigue from his bones. The warm, dry air typical of late summer in Texas embraced him as he stepped out of the truck, his combat boots meeting the ground with a familiar weight. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, streaks of color stretching across the expansive landscape. He stretched his tall, muscular frame, easing the stiffness from the long drive from the airport. At 33, David looked a bit younger than his years, save for his eyes. Those eyes had witnessed more than many could fathom during his deployments. They held a depth that spoke of challenges faced and sacrifices made. Inside his wallet, David smiled at the crayon drawing Lucas had mailed him 3 months prior. He kept it neatly folded, protected from the harsh environment overseas. It depicted their family, 3 stick figures with broad smiles in front of their modest suburban home. "Come home soon, Dad?" Lucas had written in careful, oversized letters. The simplicity and innocence of the drawing tugged at David's heart. "Well, buddy," he thought, "Dad's finally on his way." The gas station was quiet, with only one other vehicle parked near the convenience store entrance, a dusty sedan that had seen better days. The flickering overhead lights cast a warm glow on the pavement. Through the broad windows, David could see an older gentleman behind the counter, engrossed in a newspaper. His silver hair and weathered face suggested he'd witnessed many travelers pass through over the years. The scene was so peaceful, so ordinary, that it almost felt like a dream after months in a conflict zone where nothing was predictable or serene. As he inserted his credit card into the pump, his ingrained training kept him subtly aware of his surroundings, a habit he couldn't quite shake, even back home. He noted the security camera above the door, the blind spots behind the stacked boxes of windshield wiper fluid, and the clear lines of sight to the highway. These automatic assessments had become second nature, remnants of another world that often bled into his civilian life. He began filling the tank, watching the numbers climb on the digital display. The rhythmic sound of the fuel flowing was oddly soothing. His thoughts drifted to the surprise he had in store. Emily would likely shed a few tears. She always did during reunions. Her auburn hair and bright green eyes would light up when she saw him standing at the door unannounced. Lucas would undoubtedly leap into his arms. At that age, Dad was still the ultimate hero. He'd missed his son's last birthday, but the remote-controlled car tucked in his duffel bag would hopefully make up for it. He could already picture Lucas's eyes widening with joy. A light breeze carried the scent of sagebrush and distant charcoal grills, so different from the arid air he'd been breathing for the past year. The faint melody of country music played from inside the store, mingling with the chirping of crickets beginning their evening symphony in the tall grass nearby. Everything felt wonderfully normal, yet somehow exceptional all at once. Being away had given him a new appreciation for the simple pleasures of home. David glanced at his watch. 7:45. If he drove straight through, he'd be home by 9. Emily usually put Lucas to bed around 8:30, but he knew his little boy often bargained for just one more story. They'd probably still be awake when he arrived. The thought made him smile. The gas pump clicked off, and David replaced the nozzle. He decided to grab some water for the remainder of the drive, maybe a coffee to keep his energy up. The exhilaration of coming home early had fueled him so far, but fatigue was beginning to set in after the long journey. His muscles ached slightly, a reminder of the cramped transport plane and the hours behind the wheel. As he secured the gas cap, he heard the distant hum of sirens. The sound grew louder, echoing off the flat expanses surrounding the station. It was unusual for this time of evening, especially in such a quiet area. Something about the urgent wail made his senses heighten. Old instincts kicked in, and he paid closer attention. 2 police cruisers appeared on the highway, their lights flashing but sirens abruptly cut as they turned into the station. They parked near the entrance, engines idling. The officers inside seemed casual at first glance, but David noticed a certain tension in their movements. Their arrival disrupted the stillness of the evening, and a subtle unease settled in the air. David stood upright, his face composed but attentive. He could feel their eyes on him, taking in his uniform, his posture, his very presence. He'd dealt with enough unpredictable situations to sense that the quiet evening was about to change. Little did these officers know, they were about to confront the wrong soldier. The officers exited their vehicles, 3 in total, all wearing dark sunglasses despite the waning light. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the local precinct, but their demeanor was anything but professional. The lead officer, a grizzled man with a thick mustache and cold eyes, surveyed the area with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His name tag read, Sergeant Reynolds. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. The other 2, Officer Miller, a lanky man with a perpetual smirk, and Officer Sanchez, a burly figure with a shaved head and a hard gaze, followed his lead, flanking him on either side. They exchanged knowing glances, a silent communication that hinted at unspoken intentions. David sensed that this was no routine stop. "Evening, Sergeant," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying a sharp edge as he walked towards David. "That's a nice truck you've got there." His tone was amiable enough, but there was a certain undertone that put David on alert. "Evening, officers," David replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. "Just filling up before I head home." He kept his posture relaxed but ready, a subtle readiness that only someone with training might notice. Reynolds eyed him up and down, his gaze lingering on the patches and insignia on David's uniform. "Military man, huh? Where you coming from?" There was a hint of challenge in his question, as if daring David to provide the wrong answer. "Yes, sir. Just returned from overseas," David replied, keeping his responses measured. The other officers began to circle subtly, positioning themselves around him. Officer Miller pretended to inspect the gas pumps, while Officer Sanchez leaned casually against David's truck, smudging the clean surface with his hand. The deliberate disregard was not lost on David. "Must be nice, traveling the world on taxpayer dollars," Reynolds remarked, a hint of cynicism creeping into his voice. David met his gaze steadily. "Serving my country has its challenges and rewards." He sensed the provocation but refused to rise to the bait. Reynolds scoffed lightly. "I'm sure it does." He took a step closer, invading David's personal space. "Don't mind if we take a look inside your vehicle?" David's brow furrowed slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "Routine inspection," Reynolds replied. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." His eyes narrowed, and a slight sneer formed on his lips. David knew his rights. "With all due respect, unless you have probable cause, I'd prefer to be on my way." He could feel the tension escalating, the air thick with unspoken threats. Officer Sanchez pushed off the truck, taking a step towards David. "You seem awfully eager to leave. Something you're hiding." His hand rested on his hip near his holster, a subtle but clear signal. The atmosphere grew thicker. David could sense that this was more than casual intimidation. They were testing him, probing for a reaction. He noticed the old clerk inside glancing their way, concern etched on his face. "Just trying to get home to my family," David replied evenly. He shifted his stance slightly, ready to move if necessary. Reynolds smirked. "Family man, that's nice." He glanced at his colleagues. "Thing is, you match the description of someone we're looking for." David remained still, his training kicking in. "I find that hard to believe." He kept his hands visible, non-threatening. "Is that so?" Reynolds said, taking another step forward. "You're a long way from the base. Mind opening up the truck? Or do we need to do this the hard way?" David took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "I know my rights, Sergeant. Unless you have a warrant or specific cause, I'd like to be on my way." Officer Miller moved closer, his hand casually resting near his belt. Maybe you don't understand the situation. David's eyes flicked between the officers. He noted the positions of their hands, their footing, potential escape routes. No, I think I understand perfectly. Reynolds' expression hardened. Listen here, soldier boy. Out here, we make the rules. Now, are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have a problem? David realized that this encounter was escalating rapidly. These weren't officers upholding the law. They were abusing their authority. He weighed his options carefully. Engaging them physically could have serious repercussions, but allowing them to violate his rights was unacceptable. I'm not looking for any trouble. Too late for that, Reynolds sneered, reaching out to grab David's arm. Turn around and put your hands on the truck. David reacted instinctively. He sidestepped the grasp, his movements fluid and controlled. Don't touch me, he warned, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. Reynolds' eyes flashed with anger. You've just assaulted an officer. I haven't assaulted anyone, David replied calmly, and we both know it. He was keenly aware of the legal implications and the importance of staying within his rights. Officer Sanchez moved to flank him, while Officer Miller blocked any retreat towards the store. The situation was deteriorating, and David knew he needed to de-escalate, but the officers seemed intent on provoking a confrontation. Their aggression was palpable. Inside the store, the clerk, an elderly man named Henry, watched nervously. He'd seen Reynolds and his cronies harass travelers before, but this looked different. Henry picked up the phone, hesitating before dialing, uncertain of who to call when it's the police causing trouble. He decided to record the encounter on his smartphone, hoping it might be useful evidence. Reynolds pulled out his baton, tapping it menacingly against his palm. Last chance. Comply, or face the consequences. His voice was low and threatening. David's stance remained neutral, but his muscles were coiled, ready to act if necessary. Sergeant, I'm asking you to reconsider your actions. Wrong answer, Reynolds snapped. He swung the baton towards David's ribs. Without warning, Reynolds attacked. David moved swiftly, deflecting the blow with his forearm and stepping into Reynolds' space. In one smooth motion, he disarmed the sergeant, sending the baton clattering to the ground. The surprise on Reynolds' face was evident. Officer Sanchez lunged forward, reaching for his cuffs. David anticipated the move, pivoting to avoid the grasp. He used Sanchez's momentum against him, guiding the officer into Reynolds, and the two collided awkwardly, stumbling but not falling. Officer Miller drew his taser, aiming it at David. Get down on the ground, now! His hand shook slightly, betraying his nerves. David raised his hand slightly. I don't want to hurt anyone. Let's all just take a step back. He kept his voice calm, hoping to defuse the situation. Too late for that, Miller growled, firing the taser. With split-second timing, David sidestepped, and the taser probe struck the side of his truck instead, leaving scorch marks on the paint. Seizing the moment, he closed the distance to Miller, incapacitating him with a precise maneuver that left the officer disoriented but unharmed. He guided Miller's arm behind his back in a controlled hold. Reynolds recovered, furious. You're going to pay for that, he roared, reaching for his sidearm. Stop! Henry shouted from the store entrance, holding up his smartphone. I've recorded everything. Back off. His voice was surprisingly strong for his age. The officers hesitated, the reality of the situation starting to sink in. David took a step back, maintaining a defensive posture. This doesn't need to go any further, he said firmly. Reynolds, face twisted with rage and fear. He glanced at Henry, then back at David. The authoritative veneer was cracking. He knew that evidence of their misconduct would be damning. Finally, he lowered his hand from his holster. Sirens wailed in the distance. This time, the real backup was on the way. Unbeknownst to the corrupt officers, Henry had managed to call the state police, explaining the urgent situation. Moments later, additional patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing as they surrounded the station. A state police lieutenant stepped out, a tall woman with a stern expression and sharp eyes. She took in the scene with a keen eye. What's going on here? She demanded. Thank goodness you're here, Henry exclaimed. These officers attacked this soldier without cause. I've got it all on video. He held up his phone as proof. Reynolds tried to regain control. "This man resisted arrest and assaulted us!" he blustered, but there was a note of desperation in his voice. David remained composed. "They attempted to detain me without cause. I acted in self-defense." He kept his hands visible, showing he was unarmed and cooperative. The lieutenant assessed David's uniform, noting his rank and the insignia indicating his service record. She turned to Reynolds. "Is that true?" Reynolds' facade faltered. "We had reports of suspicious activity." "Cut the nonsense, Reynolds," the lieutenant snapped. "We've had multiple complaints about you overstepping your authority." She gestured to the other state troopers. "I disarm them and place them under arrest pending investigation." The troopers moved swiftly, relieving the corrupt officers of their weapons and leading them towards the patrol cars. Reynolds protested vehemently. "You can't do this. I was doing my job." "Your job doesn't include harassing innocent citizens," the lieutenant retorted sharply. "Especially not decorated veterans." Officer Sanchez and Officer Miller remained silent, their expressions a mix of shame and resignation. They exchanged glances, realizing the gravity of their situation. Henry approached David cautiously. "Are you all right, son?" he asked kindly. David nodded. "I'm fine. Thank you for your help." He extended his hand, and Henry shook it firmly. The lieutenant extended her hand as well. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I apologize for the actions of these officers. Rest assured, they'll be held accountable." "Appreciate it," David replied, shaking her hand. As the scene calmed, paramedics arrived to check on everyone involved. David insisted he was uninjured, his focus now shifting back to getting home. He glanced at the time. It was already past 8:30 p.m. "Can I go now?" he asked the lieutenant. "Of course," she replied. "We'll need your statement, but that can wait until you've had time with your family." David smiled gratefully. "Thank you." He retrieved his duffel bag from the truck bed, ensuring the gift for Lucas was undamaged. He returned to his truck, noticing the small scorch mark where the taser had hit. Shaking his head, he got in and started the engine. The familiar rumble was comforting. As he pulled back onto the highway, the weight of the encounter began to lift. His thoughts returned to Emily and Lucas, the anticipation of their reunion invigorating him. The road stretched out before him, illuminated by the soft glow of his headlights. Each mile brought him closer to home. Meanwhile, news of the incident began to spread. Henry had shared the video with local news outlets, and the story quickly gained traction. It wasn't every day that a decorated soldier stood up against corruption, and won. Social media lit up with shares and comments, many praising David's restraint and courage. Back at the station, the corrupt officers sat in holding cells, their futures uncertain. Reynolds fumed silently, his career unraveling due to his own actions. Officer Miller stared at the floor, while Officer Sanchez leaned against the wall, a look of defeat on his face. The state police launched an internal investigation, uncovering a pattern of misconduct linked to Reynolds and his cohort. Complaints from other civilians surfaced, painting a damning picture of abuse of power. The community began to rally, demanding accountability and reform. At home, Emily and Lucas were settling in for the night. Lucas was stubbornly resisting bedtime as usual. "Just one more story, Mom," he pleaded, his eyes wide with hope. Emily smiled softly. "All right, but just one more, then it's lights out." She picked up a well-worn storybook, ready to read. A knock at the front door startled them both. Emily glanced at the clock. It was past 9 p.m. A sense of apprehension filled her. She approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called out, her hand hovering over her cell phone in case she needed to call for help. A familiar voice replied. "It's me." Her heart skipped a beat. She flung the door open to find David standing there, a tired but warm smile on his face. His uniform was slightly rumpled, but his eyes sparkled with joy. "Daddy!" Lucas shouted, darting past his mother and into his father's arms. David lifted his son, hugging him tightly. "Hey, buddy! I missed you so much." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "David, you're home!" She covered her mouth, emotions overwhelming her. He met her gaze over Lucas's shoulder. "Surprise," he said softly. She embraced them both, the family finally reunited. The warmth of their embrace erased the trials of the day. In that moment, the troubles of the world faded away. They moved inside, closing the door against the night. Emily couldn't stop smiling. "You weren't supposed to be back until next week." "Got an early flight," David explained. He set Lucas down, and the boy immediately began peppering him with questions. Did you bring me anything, Dad? Did you fly on a big plane? Did you see any cool stuff? David chuckled. Slow down, buddy. Yes, yes, and yes. But first, how about we all sit down for a bit? They settled into the living room. The cozy space was filled with family photos and Lucas's drawings taped to the walls. David breathed in the comforting scent of home, a mix of Emily's lavender candles and something baking in the oven. I can't believe you're here, Emily said, still holding his hand as if afraid he'd disappear. Believe it, he replied, squeezing her hand gently. I missed you both so much. Did everything go okay? You look tired, she observed, concern creeping into her voice. Just the usual travel fatigue, he assured her. He decided not to burden her with the details of the gas station incident. It could wait. Lucas tugged at his sleeve. Dad, did you bring me a present? David grinned. As a matter of fact, I did. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out the remote-controlled car. Lucas's eyes widened. Wow, this is awesome, the boy exclaimed, examining the toy with wonder. Figured we could spend some time playing with it tomorrow, David said. Lucas hugged him again. Thanks, Dad. You're the best. Emily watched them, her heart full. How about I warm up some dinner? You must be starving. That sounds perfect, David replied. I'd love a home-cooked meal. As Emily headed to the kitchen, David began telling Lucas about some of the more light-hearted adventures he'd had overseas, carefully filtering out anything too intense. The boy listened with rapt attention. The next morning, the local news featured the gas station incident prominently. Viewers praised David's courage and composure, hailing him as a hero. Emily was surprised when a neighbor mentioned seeing David on TV. David, is there something you want to tell me? She asked playfully. He sighed, knowing he couldn't keep it from her now. There was a bit of an incident on the way home. Nothing serious. She raised an eyebrow. Nothing serious? You're on the news. He gave a brief account of what happened, emphasizing that he was fine and that justice was being served. Emily listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to pride. I'm so glad you're okay, she said, hugging him. But I'm also proud of how you handled yourself. Just did what anyone would do, he replied modestly. At Fort Hood, David's commanding officer received multiple commendations for his conduct. The higher-ups saw an opportunity to highlight the professionalism and integrity of their service members. David was called in for a meeting. Staff Sergeant Thompson, the colonel greeted him. Heard about your encounter. Impressive restraint. Thank you, sir, David replied. Just trying to do the right thing. We're considering using the incident as a training example, the colonel continued, showcasing proper conduct under pressure. David nodded. If it can help others, I have no objections. Over the following weeks, the corrupt officers faced legal repercussions. Charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and assault were brought against them. The precinct underwent a thorough review, leading to reforms aimed at preventing such corruption in the future. Community trust began to rebuild. Henry became somewhat of a local celebrity, his actions contributing to positive change in the community. He continued to run Parker's filling station, proudly displaying a sign that read, "Honest folks always welcome." Travelers passing through would stop by, some recognizing him and thanking him for his stand. The incident became a talking point at veteran gatherings and community meetings, a testament to the impact one person can have when standing up for what is right. Discussions about accountability, integrity, and the importance of supporting one another filled the air. As for David, he returned to a semblance of normalcy. The challenges he'd faced only strengthened his resolve to serve with honor. Though he didn't seek recognition, his actions left an indelible mark on those around him. One evening, as the family sat on the porch watching the sun set, Lucas curled up next to his father. The sky was a canvas of pinks and oranges, the air filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. "Dad?" Lucas began softly. "Yeah, buddy. I'm glad you're home." David smiled, wrapping an arm around his son. "Me too." Emily joined them, resting her head on David's shoulder. "It's good to have you back," she whispered. They watched as the sky transformed into a tapestry of stars, the promise of a new day on the horizon. In that peaceful moment, surrounded by the love of his family, David knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The trials of the past faded into memories, lessons learned, and stories to tell. The future stretched out before them, bright and filled with possibilities. And as the first fireflies of the evening began to glow in the yard, David felt a profound sense of peace.